First Nations acknowledge. We'll just do the First Nations acknowledgement, and then we'll move right into Thomas's presentation. And then following the question and answer portion of it, everyone else who's not on the Business Development Committee could leave, and then we'll continue with our meeting after that. All right. So if I could, we acknowledge that we are meeting on Indigenous lands known as Turtle Island that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As woodlot owners, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have been taking care of these lands for thousands of years. Long before today, there have been Indigenous peoples who have been the stewards of this place. In particular, we acknowledge the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron and Wendat people, and the territory covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to these lands. We also recognize the contribution of the Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous people who have made, both in shaping and strengthening communities and our province and our as a whole. Our recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and to bring justice for the intergenerational trauma that still affects their families and communities. I'll also just point out the OWA has got funding for an Indigenous engagement and education program that will break out over the next 3 years that'll welcome and educate at a chapter level Indigenous cultures and meanings and understandings. So thank you, Miigwech and Nyalwin. If everyone could mute their laptop or iPad, because there is a feedback that's coming back. All right, and tonight we have a special guest, Thomas Baglole. He too is a registered professional forester. He lives in Prince Edward Island, and last year he started a company called Eastern Forest Solutions. I met Thomas this summer. I've been spending summers in PI, and through that, I've been spending some time when I'm away meeting and exploring woodlots in PI, and for that matter, the North Shore of Nova Scotia with Martin last year as well, and Dan Duquette. Thomas has expertise and experience in GIS and programming, forest management modeling, including carbon. Like a lot of us, he started his career with his provincial ministry, in this case in the ministry in New Brunswick. And then recently has moved to private industry. He and his wife, Kate, own a lovely little farm on some of the highest ground in PI. And he's got some of the biggest sugar maple on the island. So please welcome Thomas. I know we can't clap or anything like that, but it's all yours, Thomas. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. It's very interesting to hear all the different projects you guys have on the go.
Thomas is a member of the OWA, by the way.
And a board member of the Prince Edward Island Woodlot Owners Association. Yeah, so as Paul introduced me, my name's Thomas Baglole, and I live in Charlottetown, PEI. And just this past summer, I started my business, Eastern Forest Solutions. Most of my business interests are in the maritime provinces, where I have kind of most of the experience and connections. So I've been working with a number of different forest products companies throughout the Maritimes, and some nonprofits, some land trusts here on the island, and supporting a small cooperative that we're getting up and running. And that's where Paul and I first started talking with Dan DuPont on our trip this past summer, driving around Nova Scotia, that we're working on getting something up and running here on PEI. And it's a small jurisdiction, but it's an interesting place to work. And I think it'll have a lot of potential parallels with what, most of the private woodlands of Ontario would be in that situation, small private holdings. So my background, as he said, is all in kind of the analytical side of the forest sector. So I worked in government for about 3 years doing strategic planning, so high level forest management planning for Crown land. And then I went to a consulting firm where I worked with clients mostly in British Columbia, but I worked with clients kind of all around the world on, again, kind of forest management planning. And then from there, I went to the timberland investment management space, which is a company, Manulife Financial, that buys timberland and manages them for institutional investors like pension funds. And after that, I went to the carbon offset world and worked for a company that was previously called Anu and is now called, previously called Blue Source and now called Anu. I think they were called Anu for about a month of my time before I went out on my own. And so today I'll just talk a little bit about woodlot owner groups and woodlot groups in the 21st century and some opportunities and insights from the East Coast. And when I say in the 21st century, what that really means is carbon. We'll talk a lot about carbon. First of all, just kind of, I think there's quite a cross section of folks on the line. So I'll move fast through some of the background and then into some of the details. And then I'll give some insights about, I'm just going to get my screen to move, about what we're thinking here on PEI and how I think that will grow quickly to other maritime provinces and provinces like Ontario. So can everyone see, you can see my screen, right, Paul, the presentation overview?
Yep.
Okay. So
Sure
we'll
can.
talk, perfect. So we'll talk about carbon offsets, the markets, and forestry project types. And then I'll give some details about forest carbon for small landowners. And then project details and registry overview. So we'll look quickly at the registry. Or a couple of registries. I think it kind of demystifies things a little bit. I'll show you where things are, and then depending on how technical you are, you could go and dig into it a little bit. I personally find it kind of valuable. And some of the plans we have for Prince Edward Island and how that fits into some of the provincial government's objectives for climate change mitigation. And then some final thoughts to maybe spur the question and answer period. And I'm open to being interrupted at any point. So I'll fly through this, but essentially, a carbon offset is a tradable instrument that represents 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents sequestered or the emissions avoided to the atmosphere due to a change in a specific activity. So there's a ton of different definitions about that. The first one here is carbon credits and carbon offsets. Generally, I use them interchangeably, but I think some people have some kind of technical differences when they're differentiating them. But for all intents and purposes, they generally can be used interchangeably. So this is from Ecosystem Marketplace. They're a group that provides a lot of analysis of the carbon markets, and they publish it in a free publication that folks can look at to get a sense of what the carbon markets are doing. This is from the American Carbon Registry. Again, they have their own definition of carbon offsets. They actually call their carbon offsets. So if you create carbon credits or carbon offsets through this organization, it's called an emission reduction ton or an ERT. And then another one of the big organizations is Verra. And when you create credits under the Verra Carbon Registry, they're called VCUs, voluntary carbon units or verified carbon units. So then carbon offset projects, that's essentially how you create a carbon offset credit. These projects define the activities that claim to be net positive on atmospheric GHG. Projects generally rely on what's called a baseline scenario and then a project scenario. So the baseline is what the project is trying to avoid. And then the project is what the landowner in our situation will do or will probably do moving forward. And we'll discuss that a little bit more later. And this is the way that they're modeled. There's different types of baselines and project scenarios, but this gives you a sense of the different types of registries, Climate Action Reserve and American Carbon Registry. Both of those two different reserves have different what are called methodologies that essentially define the way that you estimate the GHG impact of your project. And then carbon offsets are third-party verified to ensure compliance with the methodology and all applicable standards. And the offsets are then serialized and then created on the registry, where they can be sold or traded, and retired is the ultimate use for these, meaning that they cannot be sold again, and they've essentially offset someone's emissions or made a claim to that. So where you have carbon offset credits, you also obviously have markets to trade these. So carbon markets are very complex and rapidly changing. I'm not a market analyst. I'm not involved in trading in the markets or anything like that, but it's something you cannot overlook. I would say they're very volatile, and they can be very volatile, but they're also growing very rapidly. So carbon market terminology, you have a project, you generally have a carbon developer, so someone that helps to create the credits, and those are hosted on a registry, and then they're all encompassed within the markets where they're trying to sell those credits to. Demand for voluntary carbon credits has grown substantially. So I think it's grown 4 times in the last, excuse me, 2 times about in the last 3 to 4 years. So it's a rapidly growing market, and there's a lot of kind of supply and demand imbalance that's currently taking place. Buyers in the markets come from many industries, spanning from energy, kind of the obvious players that you would think that have what are called net zero commitments or commitments to reduce their emissions. And some portion of those emissions reductions will come from supporting something like a forest carbon project or some other type of carbon offset project. Nature-based solutions, where forestry fits within, are a very large part of this puzzle and probably the largest currently. So improved forest management and afforestation and reduced deforestation projects are a pretty large component of overall carbon markets. But supply and demand, as I said previously, is very imbalanced. As of 2020, during COVID, there's just been a substantial increase in net zero claims, and it takes upwards of 12 to 24 months to really have credits created. So there's a substantial lag in the amount of credits on the market, and as well, you have a lag in landowners joining in. This is just from a forest carbon credit perspective, and then as well as people available to create the credits. So there's projected to be, good price pressure on offset credits into the future. Prices currently sit at about $15 Canadian per ton. That's the most open market information that I can provide. I think I've seen some other information that supports that. So it's about $15 a ton is roughly where I think someone could comfortably think that every single forest carbon credit would be selling for. So then forest carbon project types, there's a number of different types that can be created. We'll go through those quickly. And you have to recognize some can't be created in Canada. So there's what are called improved forest management projects, there's afforestation projects, and there's avoided conversion projects. Most often for a working forest or a forest that has active management, improved forest management is the most conducive type of project, and it allows you to do things like extend your rotation age, reduce the amount of harvest overall, and different shifts in your management, types of silvicultural practices. So shifting to single tree selection or uneven age management as opposed to even age management systems. It depends on your forest type, obviously, but these are the different types of forest carbon offset projects, but most often improved forest management is the most conducive in the Canadian forestry context. And so this is a methodology. The first one I have there on the screen, it's improved forest management on Canadian forest lands. And so this was active as of September 2021. I think there's a number of different projects being developed in Canada under this registry right now, or under this methodology right now. There's been none posted to the registry, but there probably will be some in the near future, showing projects that are ongoing on print or in Canada. This is another methodology. So this is a methodology for improved forest management through extension of rotation age. This is with the verified carbon standard, or the VERA registry. It's generally speaking, I would say, quite similar to the one on the left. We don't have to get into the markets substantially, but for example, Europe tends to prefer credits on the VERA registry. And the American Carbon Registry, I don't think there's, from North American buyers, I don't think there's a lot of preference on those types of, on what type of credits, but and that's likely due to the fact that essentially most credits in North America for improved forest management projects are created on the American Carbon Registry. And then this one, so approved VCS methodology VM0012 is improved forest management in temperate and boreal forests, and that LTPF stands for logged to protected. So this is a methodology that allows landowners to switch their land from being a working forest or a timber management forest to a protected forest. So I think, for example, the Dark Woods Forest Carbon Project in British Columbia was created under this methodology. There's a company on Vancouver Island working on a project right now, Mosaic Forest Management. I forget the amount of area that they're putting in, but that this is used in some cases in Canada as well. And then there's one that's under development. So this is getting away from voluntary carbon markets, but this is getting into the federal greenhouse gas offset system. And so ECCC means Environment and Climate Change Canada, the federal government. I have spoken with them in the last year, and last I heard, they were hoping to have that improved forest management on private lands methodology out last fall and or early this year. But I think people have heard that different times, so it's yet to be seen having an actual protocol or methodology to create forest carbon credits to sell into the federal greenhouse gas offset system. But that should be coming, and that's an opportunity for landowners. And again, I don't have a lot of information on that protocol at this point, but when I did speak with them, I was asking them a number of questions from Prince Edward Island's perspective, and they said, yes, the ability to aggregate multiple landowners into a single project will exist. So I think it's something that can be explored, and that it is a potential in the future. So just to get into a couple projects that have been done on small private woodlots, to get past kind of some of those higher level details into what could be relevant to the Ontario Woodlot Association. So we'll look at this one, which is created on the American Carbon Registry. And this is a aggregated small landowner. IFM stands for Improved Forest Management Project. And this project was created with essentially the American version, the original version of that Canadian methodology that I showed the cover page of on the previous slide. And this is just a screenshot from the American Carbon Registry. So anyone can go and search about these projects. You can go and read the different documentation that the people creating the projects have submitted. Whether the project is active or it's successful or issuing credits, you can kind of find all of this information on there. And this project's in Vermont, so I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but we'll just take a quick look at it. And then we'll look at one on the VERA registry. So this is a grouped Canadian project. It's interesting in that it actually has ARR, which is afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation, I believe. The ERA is extended rotation age, so essentially an improved forest management component, and log to protected forest. So this is all within one project within Quebec. and they have multiple project types. So it's allowing the project to, you know, establish new forests on old fields, to allow some landowners to decide to protect their forest in perpetuity in the log to protected forest, and then to allow some landowners to do something like extend their rotation age to create emissions reductions. So I find this one quite interesting, but they're both of them will have a place and will potentially have points of interest for the OWA that you could consider moving forward. So the Quebec one on the Vera Carbon Registry, so it's called the Pivot Forest Carbon Project. It's led by Eco Tierra. They're a Quebec company that I think this is their first project that they're working on in North America, but they've done a lot of work in developing countries. They're working with various aggregators, and aggregators are essentially the organization that brings together multiple landowners. They're hoping to enroll about 15,000 hectares in 5 years. And as I said previously, there's various activity types in a single project. And I just saw recently they actually, I believe it's their first sales, but they sold some credits to Dr. Pepper Canada. So there's a lot of big players that support some of these projects, and we'll look at the website of this project, but they, you know, marketing is important. Every aspect of the project that you create is important to ensure that you get the best price at the end of the day. And then Cold Hollow to Canada. So this is in Vermont. This is the one on the American Carbon Registry. So it's led by the Vermont Land Trust and a nonprofit group called Cold Hollow to Canada. And I believe the mission of this nonprofit is to establish kind of a wildlife corridor in some of those mountains you see on the map there, coming up to Canada through a unique part of Vermont and others. So I believe that the Nature Conservancy and some other groups are involved in helping them get this project off the ground. And it's an aggregation of 10 landowners owning about 8,700 acres. So the difference on the outset of this project and the one we looked at previously is this project, to my understanding, does not plan to add land on an annual basis, whereas the Pivot project that we looked at on the last slide is doing that, and that's a part of their plan. You can do that on the American Carbon Registry, so you can establish a project with a specific acreage in the first year and then add land kind of on a perpetual basis moving forward for, I think, a time period of 5 years is where that maxes out. You have to kind of start a new project if you want to add any more land. And it's supported, I think, pretty heavily by Amazon through the purchase of offsets from that project. So before I get into that, this is where I wanted to show the group. I'll first show Pivot. So this is the website for the Pivot project, and it's quite interesting. And I suggest anyone that's interested to take a look through it if you haven't heard of it before. This is something that we in the East Coast potentially will consider emulating to some extent. So they've got a beautiful website, Pivot project. I'm not francophone, but Project Forest. It has a really nice kind of marketing material that they're going, and this is where they're looking to aggregate landowners and bring landowners into the fold. So it's a grouped project currently being validated by the VCS, which is the Verified Carbon Standard, which will generate ex post credits. It offers activities that are part of Nature Solutions, is the only project of its kind in Quebec. I'd say it's probably the only project of its kind in Canada. I'm actually surprised they're kind of limiting themselves to 15,000 hectares. I think they could probably grow faster than that, but there's maybe a reason for that. So these aggregators at the bottom, some of these are forestry cooperatives and a number of different organizations that are bringing land into the project. again, I think, you know, the Ontario Woodlot Association, its associated chapters could certainly play a pretty large role to do something similar to this. And then I won't get into the Cold Hollow to Canada project too much more, because we'll look at that in detail kind of from the financial side of things and the credit side of things. But I'll then move to showing everyone what the registries look like. And anyone, feel free to stop me if you have any questions here as I'm going through. But essentially, this is the American Carbon Registry. This is the Verra Registry, and this is Canada's GHG offset system. I'm quite certain that any projects that we do here in Maritime Canada will be in any one of these three registries using their methodologies, unless something else of value comes out in the next couple of years. I'd say we'll be leaning heavily on these. So the American Carbon Registry, as I showed, you can go directly into it, and you can go to how it works and go to the public registry and project reports. You can go to issued credit reports to see how many credits a different project has received. And then I generally go over here. Again, if I'm getting too technical, I apologize. You could search just for all forestry projects, but what I'll do is I will put in, I'm just going to scroll up. So ACR 519 is the project ID that I want to look at. And this is the Cold Hollow to Canada project. So we can go in project name. Cold Hollow to Canada Improved Forest Management Project is located on, they say 9,700 acres here. From what I found in the documentation, it's actually about 8,700 of mixed hardwood and conifer forests in north central Vermont. By committing to maintain forest CO2 stocks above the regional common practice, the project will provide significant climate benefits through carbon sequestration. So you have a very simple kind of explanation of the project, and then you go into the documents and you can read through all of these different pieces of information. So if you want to dig into a project, generally the GHG plan, so the greenhouse gas plan, has a lot of the valuable information that explains how they did the project development, how they plan to monitor it moving forward. And there's all the other reports from the verification firm. So they've hired SCS Global. There's other companies like KPMG. They do this type of auditing, and a number of other companies. And again, you can do the exact same thing in the Verra registry. So if you go over to the Verra registry, I think it's actually maybe a little bit slower. You can go to the verified carbon standard, search for projects, all projects, ID. I believe I have 1916 is the pivot project. So the Quebec Forestry project. So this is with a different company or on a different registry using a different methodology. But this is that pivot project that we looked at. So they're pretty much everything I'm showing you in the presentation today, I've pulled from these different resources and my understanding of different project types. And that's how we're formulating our ideas here in the Maritimes. And again, you can go through and read all the different documentation to get a sense of how to do project development. So I know there's not a lot of information there. It's maybe a little technical. I can send the links at a later point, but the reason I wanted to show that is just kind of, again, to demystify it a little bit for any of maybe the more technical people that would like to read into these projects, to get an idea and start to think in your mind, what type of project would the OWA like to do, or what type of projects is probably a better word, because I think there's a number of different situations that any of our groups would run into. So what is the opportunity? I should have a question mark on that title there, but that's okay. So Cold Hollow to Canada. Again, I took this through the GHG plan. So it's got an average stocking of about 149 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per acre. That number doesn't mean too much. And Paul's on the line. He sent me some data and I did not get a chance to go through it. It was probably for Southern Ontario. So I thought that this property would be a good kind of conduit for us to look at and think about what the properties would be like. So 149 tons is a pretty strong starting amount of CO2. That's a pretty rich, well-stocked forest. Here in maritime Canada, I would expect numbers probably closer to 80 to 100 at the higher end, due to the fact that, first of all, we have a lot of clear cuts here that really pulls down that average stocking in terms of how much carbon's on the landscape. And these are very tall, very well-stocked northern hardwood forests in Vermont, and we kind of have more mixed forests. Parts of Ontario would be much closer to this. Not necessarily that all projects or properties would start at this average stocking. I think they probably picked the best of the best when they were working on their first project. Just looking at some of the documentation, so they probably, the property, you know, when it's not being managed, probably grows about 2.5 to 3 tons of CO2 per acre per year. So as we talked about previously, describing different types of forest carbon projects, the first thing you do is you model the baseline. And essentially, the baseline determines the difference between whatever you do and what's verified and how many credits you create. So there's a lot of discussion around these baselines and how aggressive some of them are and whether they're actually real. I won't get into that in depth. We can talk about it, but essentially this property, the baseline, using an optimization model. So the type of work that I do for a lot of clients, it essentially determines in a computer model, if the landowner doesn't join this project, what stands would they decide to cut? This is all following the rules of the methodology, and it's following what's called the common practice to the region. So what are the common types of forestry practices in that region? So in a place like Vermont, and what's legally permissible? What can the markets, so how much, you know, if you had 100,000 acres, you couldn't actually cut it all in 2 or 3 years, but if you had 2,000 or 3,000 acres, you know, it's more likely that that property would be liquidated in the absence of the project. If it were to move to different hands, there's always a risk of that. So these markets are, they're being debated all the time, or the different way the projects are created. But yeah, we can talk about that some more if anyone's interested in it. But this is the baseline that they modeled. And the project scenario, so the green line on that chart on the right, shows what they estimated. So the baseline is set in stone once the project is approved in the first year. The project scenario is not set in stone, other than the fact that once you start the project, you can no longer deplete the carbon stocks. So that's the only kind of the only rule once you're in the project. Obviously, like you still have flexibility in your management, so you can opt to harvest some amount of your growing stock in 1 year, as long as your property never goes down in the amount of carbon that's stored on the landscape. And this is partially the reason many landowners kind of need to group together into one project is, first of all, for the impediments of the costs of creating the project, but also because the more land that you have, the more flexibility it allows you to kind of balance the harvesting among the different landowners. Because, you know, we still want to maintain a vibrant private forest sector, and we still want active woodlot management. So it's the more land you have, the more you could kind of balance that from year to year and as needed. So what they modeled is a pretty conservative project scenario at roughly 50% of the growth. So they're probably cutting about 1 to 1.5 tons of CO2 per acre per year in their modeled project scenario. But you can see in that table on the right, so this is what they've estimated the project scenario will look like. So you can just look the live CO2 per acre. It's going to essentially over the next 40 years, the property will go from having about 149 tons of CO2 to 171 tons of CO2 stored per acre on the property. And meanwhile, they've always all along they will plan to produce harvested wood products through, you know, partial management. And so for the American Carbon Registry, if you have a project, you have to, and you plan to do harvesting, you have to be certified in some way. So either FSC, SFI, or in the US American Tree Farm System. So I know that the OWA has their FSC certificate, so that would be actually a critical component to this. The only other thing that potentially would work is, I think in the methodology, it says, or like a government approved forest management plan. So maybe the managed forest tax incentive program would work as well. That's something you'd have to confirm with the verification body and the registry during project development. So the project, it was projected to generate. So I just added up all of the what are called ERTs. So this is the amount of emission reduction tons that they've estimated they will get. So additional CO2 is before, again, I didn't get into all of the background. It's before what's called leakage and the buffer pool. So leakage is the recognition that some of that CO2 that they've stored additionally will be emitted additionally somewhere else, because essentially they're opting not to harvest. So some portion of that harvest will leak onto another landscape. And then the buffer pool is, we could look at it on the registry. You can go look at it at any time. It's essentially an account on the registry where every forestry project has to put some credits. It's the risk management tool for the registries. So if one project burns down completely, the entire system is still carbon neutral or carbon negative. It would obviously be a very bad thing if all of the buffer credits ever went into up in smoke, but that would never happen. There's a ton of credits in those buffer pools. Every project puts 18 to, I don't know the highest percentage, but there's kind of a risk rating based on where your forest is and things like the fire cycle in the area. But just looking at what that project is projected to generate. So I multiplied the first 5 years, so 2019 to 22, by about $15 per ERT, and averaged that to about $75 per acre per year. You know, when I talk to people here on the island, that is at the higher end of what I would estimate for a lot of our forests here on PEI and in the Maritime provinces. I think at the lower end, it would be in the $15 to $20 an acre a year, up into the $75 an acre a year. The other detail that everyone might kind of see here. So as you see over time, the project issues less ERTs. This is due to the fact that you're being compensated. If you remember back to the figure showing the baseline, some of those ERTs are what are called avoided emissions rather than sequestration. So essentially by the year 2027, if we were to look back to that figure, the modeled baseline, if you're looking at me at all, I did air quotes there, but it assumes that if the project doesn't exist, there would be a depletion of growing stock. So in those first, 8 years, the landowner is essentially being compensated to lock in all the carbon they've got on the land today and decide not to do that. And then after 2028, your only credits are essentially what are called kind of growth credits. The interesting thing there, so the first thing that you'd all notice, there's a lot less credits once the growth credits are the only credits being issued. And that could look very bad, obviously. The first thing is, hopefully by 2028, they're worth a lot more. And the second thing is in the market, what's starting to occur is people are opting to pay less for those avoided conversion credits and pay more for the growth credits. So someone that's looking to offset their emissions would rather buy a credit due to the growth of the forest in that same year, and they're paying a premium for removals credits. So by 2028, essentially 100% of those credits would be removals credits. Yeah, so that's another detail, but essentially that's what the crediting would look like for this project specifically. And that $75 an acre a year, I don't know if I said that, but that was me just assuming $15 per ton. So there's no price appreciation assumed in those 5 years, which hopefully and most likely there will be. So I spoke a lot, just kind of at a high level, about forest carbon projects. That's leveraging my background and my experience to identify how we're thinking here in the Maritimes, and how I think someone like the OWA could start to think through, as you're forming your cooperatives, or as the OWA has all of their chapters and the different organizations that there's a lot of interest from the private woodlot sector to find some alternative market for their woodlot, and to assist them and support them in being stewards and holding on to that land. So we're working on a forest owners cooperative. There's the business plan, or a picture of it, on the right-hand side. So it's called the Sustainable Forest Alliance. I think they were incorporated in November, and we finished that business plan. That says December 21. I think it was really formalized in January or February 22. We're in the pretty early stages of this. There's been a number of attempts at starting cooperatives and starting different types of organizations on PEI over the years. This will be distinctive to our Prince Edward Island Woodlot Owners Association, largely due to the fact that the PEI WA wants to stay out of active management of woodlots, and we saw an opportunity to become more involved in the active management of woodlots. And so the SFA and the PEI WOA have an MOU to work closely together, where the WA is more interested in education and representing all woodlot owners, and a number of different kind of other initiatives that they focus on, where the SFA, or the Sustainable Forest Alliance, will be more involved in providing services on the ground and in other capacities for landowners. We have a small private forestry consulting sector here on PEI, but it's dwindling. There's no new entrants. And so we see the opportunity to kind of create an organization that can provide those services. And that landowners are all committed and bought into. And we have pretty lofty goals that I'll explain to, but essentially the services that'll be provided would be a woodlot management plan. We have a provincial program that provides some rebates to create those management plans. So it's called the Forest Enhancement Program. And as well, once those management plans are created, there are rebates to actually do some of the work. So things like selection harvesting, there's a rebate to allow, to entice contractors to go in to do those types of treatments. Most of the maritime provinces have a similar program. They're all administered in different ways. But that one on Prince Edward Island is administered directly by the province. So any forestry consultant can operate within that. And so the consultants that work with or for the SFA will just be operating as another consultant within that program. And then from there, we plan to actually do all operations negotiations. So tendering of any harvesting that we plan to do on member woodlots, once approved through the management planning process, coordination and supervision. This is just, again, for woodlot owners that do not actively manage their woodlot themselves, which I think on PEI, that would have been a large component 10 to 20 years ago. It's a very small component now of people that are actually out doing the management themselves in their forests. forest certification and other value-added services. So we're contemplating something like an FSC certificate. It has to have a value proposition, and where we think that has the value proposition, there's one component I'll speak to on the next slide, but is obviously in carbon. So forest carbon offset aggregation and project development is something that we're hoping the SFA can help landowners on, to connect them to the right folks to bring that to the forefront. We plan to do collaboration with environmental NGOs. So for anyone that's familiar with our landscape, in many private kind of forested landscapes, there's a lot of pressures on the land. So we want to help kind of the forest be considered and have all private woodlot owners at the table of things like landscape level planning and how we can have a more robust and a healthy forest and forest landscape in the future. So forest sector and market development. So one thing that we're aware of in our region is a lack of silvicultural and harvesting contractors and capacity. And so again, our business plan is pretty lofty. We have a lot of ideas, but we want to work with someone like our local community college to try and develop a program that could get someone. We have a farm technician program that creates, I think they're called Blue Seal, not Red Seal certified farm technicians that learn everything from how to fix equipment to how to do crop scouting. So we're kind of thinking of along the lines of something like that to develop the workforce for folks that want to work in the forest, and market development. So I was going to speak a little bit to our bioenergy that's on the island, and I can answer any questions on that, but it's not currently owned by the cooperative. They're all government facilities that take heat and or take wood for heat, and as well as there's a district heating facility in Charlottetown that takes the vast majority of low grade wood products from PEI. So eventually the cooperative does want to get into actually owning some forest product enterprises. And there's other people that are proposing things like renewable diesel and biochar facilities here, but there's nothing formal yet. So why? Well, the first thing is all of these plans were in the works for years before I ever got involved in talking to people. But the first one is the government has their goals for net zero, and they actually, I don't know if it's formal yet, but there's a net zero act that requires the province to do reporting and to meet these two targets. So net zero energy, so they want to produce no more GHGs from energy use than our land, ocean, and technologies can absorb. And then net zero GHG emissions, producing no more GHGs from all sources than our land, ocean, and technologies can absorb. So we were working on these ideas before these things ever came out, but we obviously see a role to play and a potential way to help the province to achieve these objectives while also helping the forest and forest owners and stewards on PEI. And so with current policies, this is the trajectory that they think the province was currently going on, and the path to net zero is what they're hoping to achieve, and land is a large part of that. It's expected that by 2030, about 10 to 15% of those emissions reductions will come from the land sector and forestry specifically, and 25 to 30% would be needed by 2040. So they have three goals. The first one is to maintain what we have. The last 10 years, 2010 to 2020, the reports aren't out yet. We redo our provincial inventory every 10 years, but there's been a lot of forest land speculated to have been lost due to increasing land prices, new entrants to our farming sector, increasing population substantially. So we've lost a lot of our forest. We were at about, I think, 45 to 50% in 2010. And that was up from, again, similar to a lot of parts of Southern Ontario, our forests were down to about 30% at the turn of the 1900. And so they bounced back due to kind of farmland abandonment after World War II. but we're going back in the other direction again. So that's a concern. Grow what we need. So that's through, improved forest management and growing forests on currently fallow land is a large part of the province's objectives. But we deeply believe that we need to manage what we have better. And the province has objectives around that. And then invest in early stage objectives or technologies. So that's like biochar is a big topic of conversation. So as I said, the Sustainable Forest Alliance sees a huge opportunity to essentially support the province in this. So our plans as the cooperative, we plan to grow to about 100,000 acres under 5 years, under management in 5 years. And we're just going public. So most people in PEI haven't heard all these details yet, but we're going public this year. And we have about 20,000 acres of folks that are interested, and we're ready to have them sign up and start providing them services. But one of the province's objectives is that 50% of woodlots employ sustainable forest management practices by 2030. And they have that as defined by partnership with industry. So we do want to take it one next step, as I said, towards FSC certification or some sort of third-party verified verification of our forestry practices and systems. But we just see it as we were working on this business plan and these ideas, and they were crying for them in this net zero framework that they've put out, wherein forests and forestry historically have always been undervalued and not considered in kind of public policy here. So we know that 100,000 acres is a very large objective. And why would people want to join? So to become FSC certified, that will help the folks that already have a ecological ethos to their management and want that to be kind of, they would see value in that just intrinsically. But where we think most people will want to join is the verified carbon projects. Because right now their only opportunity, we have pretty aggressive forestry practices. So every 40 to 50 years, it's essentially a liquidation harvest. And instead, if we can give a guy or gal or whoever that owns 100 acres of forest, if we could help them to get something like $3,000 a year, and still to do their harvests, their thinnings and different types of treatments as needed, then we'd love to be able to do that. And we think that'll just help to grow our organization rapidly. So carbon is absolutely critical to our strategy. And then high quality services and new market opportunities. So I think I'm close to over time, but just some final thoughts. So for the OWA is first that carbon markets are growing and rapidly changing. Forests are a valuable resource in climate change mitigation and many other purposes. Forest landowner groups like the OWA, I think you're well situated. I brought some of those examples, not with any Ontario specific data, mostly due to time constraints. I didn't have a chance to look through what I was shared, but I think that's something, we could all, I'd love to work with you on to get an idea of what the opportunities would be like for some of your different groups. But forest carbon projects align very closely with the OWA FSC program. I think it'd be a natural kind of duty to put on Glenn Prevost to start bringing some of this out. Numerous options on how to structure, manage, and finance the projects. And I didn't speak a lot to it, but the Ontario Woodlot Association's LiDAR data and other internal capacities. So like from your folks like Ben that really have some of that technical capacity would really put you ahead of the curve. There's a number of technology providers that are trying to allow remotely sensed carbon credits to come to fruition. As you can imagine, people are buying these credits. So up until now, most offset credits actually have a plot in the forest that someone goes to measure as part of the verification process. And I don't see that going away altogether, but like the Vera Registry is really putting a push on completely digital monitoring of projects, reporting, and verification. So the LiDAR really puts you at the head of the curve. And I think that would be would be something you have to, you'll want to leverage in this whole process. And so ultimately, improved management of forests and a value proposition to woodlot ownership is increased through carbon markets and projects, and membership in groups like yours and the one that we're working on here. So that's my I think I'm over time, Paul, but
no, it's worth it. Very interesting, very detailed. Wow. And it was nice that you showed the two different programs, the American and the Vera. Question for you that I had, just on the natural based solution slide, which is at the very beginning, and it was showing volume. Was afforestation a very small amount? It was additionality way more than afforestation?
I think that was showing either dollars of credits sold or number of credits sold.
Okay.
Afforestation is, I don't know how large of the overall forestry project component afforestation projects are, but they're mostly in developing countries. I think it's an economic issue. Like, our land is too expensive in many cases and to do afforestation at scale. So there's a lot of afforestation projects that have gone on in developing nations. Yeah.
Okay. Questions? We do have a few minutes. It is 10 after, 5 minutes. It's worth it if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, it's Martin. I got a couple of questions. The first, when you talk ton, I assume you're talking metric tons.
Yes. Yeah.
How do the American people?
Every credit is fungible, not fungible, but every credit represents the same amount, a metric ton of CO2.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you talk about the external certification audit component, I take it there is a field component. It's not just like a chain of custody paper audit.
Yeah. So well, okay, that's a good question. So I'm less familiar with the Vera projects, but for American Carbon Registry, so in year one, you write your documentation like you would for like the GHG plan, and then the verifier would go and sample. I think it's about 10% of your plot network. So if you have 200 plots, there'd be 20 plots that are sampled. And you have to meet, so on the amount of carbon stored in the forest, you have to be within plus or minus 5% at a 95% confidence interval. So that's why I said, like, the LiDAR is great and it's good that you have it, and people are hoping to start, verifying credits using it, but it's not there today. But you need to stay on top of it, because today the methodologies still require that field component to verify the actual carbon is there in those plots. So yeah, it's the same type of, you probably know all the folks that do it. Most of them, I think a lot of them do SFI or FSC certification audits as well.
The same type of, whether it's SAI Global or KPMG people doing it on the ground. I was just a little concerned it was just going to be a KPMG CPA. No.
They're generally all forestry professionals. So they go out and you're on a plot, and someone measured a 21.1 dBH and the verifier thinks it's 21.0 type of thing, and then or it's like an estimate of how healthy the crown is, whether there should have been a deduction on how much carbon was in that. So it's a forestry professional that goes out and looks. But what I was saying about ACR, that's in year one, but in the intermediate years, between years 1 and 5, it's only a desk audit. So you don't have to fly the verification firm there to measure the plots again, but you do at year 5, and then you have to redo the full inventory again at year 10. So the desk audit is intermediary. They make sure there's been no fires and everything, but in year 1, it's in the field.
What about NGOs? Especially in the Maritimes with the Ecology Action Center, they opposed FSC type certification. Have you got any pressure?
They've opposed it or proposed it?
Opposed it. They feel it's a smokescreen for industry.
I've heard that more for SFI. I feel like they're all on the side of FSC. But
Not the ecology action.
okay, well, I don't think the Ecology Action Center is on the side of too much. I'm not sure, but
Okay, that's good.
that's like, they're a Nova Scotia based organization, and Nova Scotia forest sector has a lot of public perception issues and a lot of yeah. So but FSC, I think most people still think of it as the gold standard, even in the environmental NGO community.
That'll read that component in Ontario's puts them ahead of a lot of the woodlots in the Maritimes.
Yeah.
Thomas, I'm just wondering about, you mentioned forest fire management as being something that could impact the results here in the forest management practices. It has a very major role to play in Ontario, and we spend over $100 million each year trying to tackle it, and yet it's to a large extent uncontrollable. And with climate change, it's not likely to get any better. Can you talk a bit more about how you're going to deal with that factor when it comes to measuring credits and controlling them?
Yeah, so it's a good question. You know, well, so we just had a huge hurricane here on PEI, and a lot of trees are, like, essentially in a lot of woodlots, you can barely walk through them. There's so much damage. So at the end of the day, when it actually comes to creating credits, you have a calculation that's defined. The programs are very rules based, and all the rules are laid out in the methodology, and it says, you know, if you're in this forest region, this is your fire risk. And you hope that in your project length, so 40 years in the American Carbon Registry, that your forest doesn't burn down. But the nice thing about it being an improved forest management project, that allows you to do active forestry, and so you can do like those kind of fire smart treatments, you know, spacing the trees. It doesn't. I don't think it gives. It allows you to put less credits in the buffer pool or anything like that. Your buffer pool, you put it in. If your forest burns down, you're not liable to pay back all your credits because everyone put their credits into the buffer pool. So there has been projects in California that have burned, but the folks that own that land weren't liable to pay off that amount of carbon that was emitted because they contributed to the buffer pool. So did everyone else. If every project starts burning like we do, you know, we are stuck in droughts every summer forever, and hardwood forests in Vermont are burning, we'd be in a lot of trouble. So I don't know if that answers it very well, Jack.
It does. And ideally, the province or whoever would end up putting money into evaluating the carbon credits that might be gained associated with protecting the forest. So that, again, may be a carbon exercise. I'm not aware of it happening, but because that could be significant if we could reduce the amount of fire damage or any natural cause damage, blowdown, whatever. If we could reduce that significantly, that could mean a lot in terms of credits.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, I think what these markets would do for landowners is it changes the economics, whether the markets exist for 20 years or 40 years. Like, hopefully it changes the economics for the next 20 years that allows you to make the best decisions to meet your objectives and to do things like climate change mitigation and you know, a lot of people in the climate change world probably hate these markets, and then us from the forest owner world, you know, we think of them as a tool to achieve our other objectives and to help with the fight against climate change.
Anybody else? I saw that Erica had a question about, you know, the cooperatives, and you don't actually have to be touching, that you could be quite easily spread over a specific region and working collectively or aggregately together.
Yeah, Yeah, most projects have land scattered all throughout, and I think it was even in the map that I showed. Maybe I went past it already. For that Vermont project, they had I think it was 10 landowners. I'm not sure if each of those parcels is a different landowner, but it allows you to, like on PEI, we're gonna have our first 20,000 acres is mostly going to be in one little region, just by the nature of the group that started. But we want that sustainable forest lines to be province wide, and we would want to have woodlots from all over the province join the carbon projects. It does obviously make like the verification more challenging and the inventory more challenging driving, but there's no rules against it. Ontario is a bigger province than PEI, so you'd want to be more thoughtful about that.
All right, very good. I see something else from Alex. Is the $15 per, I left my screen here.
Is the $15 per ton the market price or the price you get from the registry? So the registry doesn't buy the credits. So let's say OWA starts a project with a project developer or does it in-house, and then OWA hires SCS Global or SAI Global to review their project. The project is approved. I guess you can't see my hands. I'm thinking. So the project is approved, and that verifier writes to the registry and says, they followed all the rules, they did everything right. Then the registry pays, I think it's 15 cents, maybe 15 or 5 cents. They make you pay for every credit they create. It's, they have to make their funds off the transaction. So there's registry fees, but the credits are created, they're housed on that registry, and then they're sold to someone else that wants to either speculate on them or retire them for their emissions reduction. So generally, like the Pivot project sold directly to Dr. Pepper. So you want to sell directly to the end user if you can, to get the best price. And yeah.
Right.
And one other thing on private woodlot projects, I think they have a lot of oomph and a lot of support. There's a lot of industry in Southern Ontario that would probably love to be able to put that on their website, that they're supporting private woodlot stewards of Southern Ontario, Southern and Central Ontario. And I don't know where all the private land band is, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah. Was someone else going to ask a question there?
Yeah, Tom, I just had a quick question for you. Great presentation. In your experience with these projects and using remotely sensed data, have you seen any of the carbon offset issuers set parameters for the data, like a minimum pulse density for LiDAR or maybe a maximum resolution for imagery that you can use or something like that?
I haven't seen any projects actually where the carbon estimates were, like the predictions from something like remote sensing were actually used.
Right.
So you have your plot network. So let's say you have 10,000 acres and you have 200 plots. You would stratify your forest. So you'd have like your hardwood, your mixed wood, and your softwood, or however you want to stratify it. And essentially whatever plots fall within that strata represents the CO2 in that strata.
I see. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Ben, we could talk more in detail on it.
Yeah, I'd love to.
But the Vera registry just recently put out a call for kind of pilot projects on the digital monitoring, reporting and verification. And so that's why I said, like, having the LiDAR today is a really good starting point that I think you'd want to use it before it gets old in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Or maintain it for sure.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. I'll reach out to you then.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Perfect. It was nice to meet everyone.
Yep. Thank you. Very informative. We've taped it we've taped it as well, so others will be able to see it, and it'll be on our YouTube video. So.
Oh no, you didn't tell me that.
Yeah. I'm gonna be in Nova Scotia the first 2 weeks of August, so we're probably gonna be staying somewhere on the South Shore there, so
Perfect.
I might hit up Martin on the way there and maybe have lunch or maybe dinner if he springs, but if you're down that way with your family, we can hook up then.
Yeah, I wish I could have talked to, well, I will talk to the group in, a year or two when we're further down the line on PEI, because we're in the early stages, but I've learned a lot about this stuff the last few years, and I think it's an opportunity we're going to leverage. So I was happy to present to everyone today about it.
Tom, I
Thank
finally
you.
got all the mud from your boots out of my car.
That was from that last block that Greg took us to. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I'm
All right, thank you.
See ya.